The middle passage is fourth stage, treating post-colonial stress disorder. This idea is based on expanding an individual diagnosis, which is post-colonial stress disorder, into a communal and national diagnosis. Post-colonial stress disorder is a relatively new diagnosis which isolates the source of trauma to the political, social, and racial oppression of the colonized or formerly colonized. This diagnosis then is an extension of post-traumatic stress disorder. As Uta Mittelstadt notes, PTSD is caused by a singular event or an isolated sequence of events that are commonly experienced as life-threatening, usually catch the individual off guard with a severity that shocks and impairs the individual's ability to react appropriately, indicating an acute rather than chronic trauma. PCSD, on the other hand, as Lawrence J. Kermeyer, Joseph P. Gaughan, and Joshua Moses posit, is an aggregate disorder caused by the chronic trauma of colonialism and neocolonialism experienced across generations. Thus, PCSD sufferers and their children encounter the same trauma, colonial hegemony, the symptoms of which become undercurrents of cultural and socio-political practices. Kermeyer et al. Go on to define the genesis of historical trauma, or PCSD, colonial injury, the conquest, subjugation, and dispossession of indigenous peoples. The conquest, subjugation, and dispossession of colonial injury was initiated by physical violence and perpetuated by a hegemony that replaces communalism and non-colonizer worldviews with individualism, materialism, and binaryism. Alongside the violence of conquest, indigenous and transplanted peoples suffered the violent disruption of their religion, language, and kinship. The colonizers dismissed cosmologies, ontologies, and epistemologies as quaint, childlike superstition, while asserting the colonizers' culture as universally good or superior. Exacerbating this philosophical violence are the multiple displays of hypocrisy, the debased and violent behavior of the civilized, and their denial of colonizer culpability. This combination of hegemony and blatant hypocrisy elicited two major coping strategies: pathologies and ancestral culture-based healing practices. We can consider two categories of colonial or post-colonial pathologies: obvious and disguised, or cultural pathology. The more obvious pathologies include alcoholism and substance abuse to numb the effect of colonial trauma, as well as elicit a pseudo-spiritual state, criminality to resist commodification of the body and denied resources, violence as a frustrated attempt to assert any power at all, usually directed at fellow subjugated people. More deceptive is cultural pathology. Highlighting cultural differences became a form of resistance, for example, negritude or the Black Arts movement. The problem is clinging to cultural flotsam that proves to be as harmful to development, while claiming any attempt to abandon such traditions is succumbing to hegemony. For example, clinging to corporal punishment or female genital mutilation as inherently Black, Caribbean, or African, or the adoption of homophobia because homosexuality is viewed as a white perversion. The difficulty, though, is separating this type of pathology from more productive decolonizing cultural practices. Resistance also took on more productive decolonizing cultural practices. A current example of this approach, as Kathleen Woodall explains, is a Wakotowin Strengthening Families program based in Winnipeg, which incorporates culturally specific counseling techniques when treating with Indigenous and migrant trauma patients. According to Buddle, the program's aim is to stabilize Indigenous newcomer and other youth involved in gang violence or criminal activity using anti-oppressive decolonizing programming, which include cultural reclamation and intercultural competency building. These interventions are rooted in Wakotuin, one of the basic principles of Cree natural law, the rules governing the relationship between humans and the more than human world. What Buddle describes is a return to rituals aimed at reunification and rehumanization. In general, these rituals serve to balance the spiritual and physical aspects of a human being as individuals, communities, and nations. In terms of community, as Amalidoma Purchase-Sumer asserts, communal ritual takes care of the village's need to reaffirm its unity under one spirit. On the national scale, ritual balances the individual and community by providing a space for psychic communication and harmonization. According to Kimbwande Kia Bunseki Fu Kiao, harmonization through communication is the key to human beings' game of survival. Wolesenka theorizes that catharsis is achieved through ritual engagement of the fourth stage. The ritual celebrant enters a chthonic realm, facing destruction of the ego and possibly becoming the reconstituted enlightened self. Soyinka links this process to the act of creativity and argues that the ritual immersion into the fourth stage by the artist is done on behalf of the well-being of the community. This act of creativity can be viable treatment for trauma because it is not a matter of recalling and documenting the trauma. Rather, it engages the tension between acknowledging the source of trauma and extracting creative energy from the site to rehumanize both celebrant and spectator. In literature, author Amanita Fauna asserts that she is challenging overturning one at a time those false narratives about every one of us not born at the center, persistently viewed as other to the presumed norm. Fauna goes on to state that African literature has a collective consciousness fueled by a collective outrage, one that would deny the Western gaze. Such a project requires resilience, the forging of an independent narrative identity, and knowing your own story and telling it to yourself. To know one's own story, however, requires actively engaging trauma. For example, Wilson Harris argues that the writer is involved as both a passive and creative agent in a kind of intense visualization within which one is drawn or driven to enter overlapping capacities of nature. In so doing, the author can invoke a tradition of consciousness that is non-tyrannical, does not insist on enforcement of memory, but possesses the stamp of a particular unpredictable freedom, seemingly hinged on the duality of existence. Later, Harris links entering the overlapping capacities of nature with the Middle Passage as a creative phenomenon of the first importance in the imagination of a people violated by economic fates. where the undefined limbo space allows for new connections formed with other cultures, producing a uniquely Caribbean expression that cannot be equated with the length of or duration of a single trip across the Atlantic. This makes the Middle Passage a psychic, metaphorical space, not only historical artifact or truth. The process goes on also in art. In the last chapter of her dissertation, Barbara Kimberly Robbins asserts that Native American artists address their historical trauma to treat PCSD, not just for self, but for community. Robbins highlights Edgar Heap of Birds' anti-colonial art, which Heap of Birds says has to address something important in the community. His art forces the viewer to see and process colonial trauma, visualizing pain and becoming a healing act. In dance, Camille Lamoth ascribes healing properties to dance, stating that dancing is one of the first means by which the earliest humans solidified strong social bonds, irrespective of bloodlines. Lamoth asserts that dance, the enabling condition of human bodily becoming, is crucial to the psychological development of healthy individuals. As ritual, then, dance facilitates rehumanizing the individual and reinforces communality. For example, after the genocide in Rwanda, there was a spike in severe mental stress disorders, followed by an influx of Western mental health workers, whose treatments proved problematic because Rwandans expected treatment to be communal and dancing and not isolation. In music, J.H. Kwabena Nikita states that music can be used as an avenue for the expression of group sentiments. This avenue for expression provides a rich medium for the confrontation and dismantling of a colonial trauma. For example, Claudius Fergus asserts that during the height of the Black Power movement in 1970s Trinidad, Black Trinidadians openly embraced their African religious heritage with a demand for equal respect alongside any equivalent European expression. This act of reclamation influences calypsos of the 1970s, and these Black consciousness calypsos inspired new genres that sought to recapture the griot tradition in nation songs. These nation songs, precursors to calypso, embodied a psychology of survival and emancipatory ideology. Elsewhere in the diaspora, Afrofuturists like Sun Ra and George Clinton and the Parliament Funkadelic use their music ritualistically. Itasha Womack notes that Sun Ra's music was part spiritual revolution that the artist wanted to use to heal the world. Sun Ra's healing music acts as a ritual of unification, a push for universal love, and a celebration of the unity of life, while renouncing, as J. Griffith Rolston states about Afrofuturism, the logic of linear progress that buttresses Western universalism, rationalism, empiricism, logocentrism, and their standard bearer, white supremacy. And if we put it all together, we arrive at what I call a performed narrative. So the performed narrative is communal or public storytelling rendered through several media, language, music, movement or dance, and dress or costume, simultaneously for the narrative to be fully realized. Combining these elements often has a ritual impact, especially if each thread of the narrative is employed to spur the performer and spectator into a metaphysical space. If not used deliberately for ritual purposes, the latent ritual potency can be felt as euphoria or depression, Or in the case of communal or individual crises, this latent potency can lead to an unplanned and sometimes unnameable ritual experience. In the Caribbean, large performed narratives accompany many festivals with the potential to redefine humanity and human worth. The most overt example is Carnival. To begin, Carnival is an African-derived ritual involving possession, entering the Choctonic realm. Kamal Brathwaite describes possession as one of the 5 interrelated divisions of specializations in African worship, which also includes divination, healing, and protection. As a communal ritual, Carnival may balance the spiritual and physical aspects of a human being. Carnival also allows for the release of stress or frustration and for life affirmation of its participants. When we engage Carnival actively as a communal ritual, we can engage in regional cultural exchanges, promote national and regional identities through a strong cultural production, and promote our icons as hallmarks of our national identities, eventually healing the vestiges of colonial injuries, such as divided kinship and denied spirituality. Thank you.